here's the question. Are our markets shaped by independent or social choice? For a long time, we've assumed in market research and in marketing and in most of Western culture that people make decisions on their own, and even the exciting stuff of behavioral economics in recent years showing us the quirks and unusual distortions of our cognitive lenses have not really shifted that much. But in the Facebook age, I guess you might call it, it's becoming increasingly clear that social influence has rather a larger role to play than we might have thought. Now, till now, that's been assertion, assumption, and in many ways connected with media choices in marketing terms rather than something that marketers establish by using decent research practices. And so this technique is driven by a need to understand whether or not you fall on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of that particular polar choice, whether people are choosing in the market independently or socially. And there's a kind of interesting, I seem to have gone two slides at the same time. Sorry about that, everyone. Hello. Let's go on. So if you want to know more about this later on, there's a fabulous book which is actually published today, it is based on the work I've been doing recently with Professor Alex Bentley as the new head of archaeology and anthropology at Bristol University, and Mike O'Brien, who's dean at Missouri State. Both a mixture of anthropology and archaeology in their background, so they study human behavior in all kinds of interesting ways. It's certainly true that they're terrific chaps, and they have been a delight to work with, but their work is really interesting because it perhaps build a map of human behavior using patterns that exist in data, and the key item in this is what they call social learning and what we have now chosen to call the "I'll have what she's having" effect. It turns out not just that we're quite social, but that as a species our ability to learn from each other is absolutely vital to our success. I was having a bit of a double advance here, I'm afraid. Apologies to that, everyone. There we are. Now, the rom-com movie genre seems an odd place to look for insights into human behavior, but I think this scene from the 1989 Rob Reiner movie, When Harry Met Sally, is probably one of the better ones. In it, the two central characters, who are young single New Yorkers who date and then just try and remain friends, and then date and then try and remain friends, and so on, are sitting in Katz's Deli in the Lower East Side in New York, and she, that's Meg Ryan playing Sally, challenges Billy Crystal's assertion that he can tell a fake from a real female orgasm. And so she, Sally, that's Meg, then proceeds to demonstrate what a loud whooping, table thumping, eye swiveling female orgasm looks like, much to Billy's embarrassment. At the end of this scene, which seems to last for a very long 2 minutes, I know I've timed it recently, the camera pans over to this lady of a certain age at the next table, who is, incidentally, the director's mother, Estelle Reiner, who leans towards the waiter and says, "I'll have what she's having." I'll have what she's having. Our ability to copy from other people seems to be, as far as the contemporary social science is concerned, the missing piece of the jigsaw to help us understand how behavior scales up from individual interaction through to the patterns we see in populations. It's the missing piece of the jigsaw as well in explaining how things spread through populations. So it's a really useful and powerful piece of insight into human behavior, and it's the thing that lies behind the technique that we're looking at. Now, just to be clear, what we're talking about is not boiling the ocean, despite my use of a watery metaphorical slide here. What we're talking about is spotting patterns in population level data sets, so things like sales registers, whether it's your Nielsen's, your GfK's or whatever, but we can use it in other longitudinal data sets. Spotting the patterns that exist at the market or population level which allow us to see what's going underneath. Now this is interesting because it goes the opposite way round to how we normally think about building up a model of, for example, how things spread through a population. We normally start with the individual and then build it up the other way to get the wave. We start with the wave and then use that to diagnose what's going on underneath. And to be really clear about that, I've put this visual in as well. So market level patterns reveal what lies beneath, not vice versa. And that's one of the reasons why this gives you such good ROE, return on effort, as a researcher or an analyst, because very quickly you see very clear patterns that distinguish things. So much for the talk on that. Let's look at a practical example. So imagine we were looking at the consumer electronics business, and I've looked at this repeatedly in the last year or two. Representing this spectrum from independent choice to socially shaped choice, have on the one hand, on the left side, you see someone examining all the features and functions of a particular camera. The individual, you might say, is discovering and buying a product independently of people around them. And on the other end, you have someone, this happens to be will.i.am, wearing Dr. Dre Beats headphones, which you might have seen around the streets, or in the younger members of the organisations that you work in, or indeed at duty-free stores around the world. Here you've got someone who's buying things not necessarily on the basis of the product's quality, but rather on the basis of its social value, the popularity and so on of it. Thanks to the work of Alex and Mike, we're able to see at a population level two different kinds of patterns when we plot out the sets. And this is a really simple non-time series plot. So on the y-axis we've got sales, or it could be share, works the same way. And on the x-axis you've got rank from high to low. So the intersection of those two axes, the bottom left of each of those two graphs is 1. So that's the highest ranking, most popular, biggest selling item in a market. Now, you may well recognize the pattern on the right as being something that's written about more broadly in non-fiction at the moment. About 4 years ago, Chris Anderson, who went on then to found TED, wrote a book called The Long Tail, in which he described the very many different occurrences of the long tail distribution in what he calls culture markets and in modern consumer culture generally. A long tail distribution is one in which very few items account for much of the volume, and most of the items in a market account for very little share of it. He, of course, was interested in seeing what the internet in particular had done to enable the long tail to get ever longer, enabling, for example, Amazon to carry many more items, go further down the tail than a traditional music or bookstore might. So that was his interest in it. But what he didn't ever think about was why on earth long tail distribution should be so important. And in fact, it's because it's a signature of social copy. And increasingly in our world, with too many things and too many choices, which is characteristic in many markets today, social choice makes it easier than considering the item properly. Very different, as you can see, from what from the pattern you see on the left. In fact, there's a special case version of this, which is Andrew Ehrenberg's negative binomial Dirichlet distribution, which is a straight line rather than a converse line like that. Anyway, so those two patterns appear, and as soon as you see one of those, you know what kind of end of the scale you are at. So let's just look at some real markets here. And I've plotted out again a spectrum here with 5 markets I've done the math on, as they say, in recent past, and it's interesting to ponder which of those fit where. So the first one, just might tell you, is popular music download. There's been a lot of work done in this area because it's a free, relatively free, and huge and long time series data set that's available to academics to study. So that one is interesting, pop music. Charitable giving is another one which is kind of interesting. We imagine that people do this independently based on their particular connections with a concern and so on. car insurance, a different kind of category again. How on earth do we choose car insurance? How on earth do we distinguish between the different ones? What does that tell us about how people choose? Deodorants, an interesting market. Deodorants, Reed toothpaste, and a number of other low interest FMCG categories, and finally spirits. So here's how they plot. On the right-hand side, with a long-tail distribution, is popular music downloads. Again and again and again, you see the popular music downloads reflecting that. You've got this. You see the pattern on Amazon. You see it for Real World on Amazon. You see it for the New York Times bestsellers in terms of bookstores, as well as Total Market. Exactly the same pattern again and again and again. Long-tail distribution. Duncan Watts and Matt Salganik's work on the downloads thing is very interesting. 3 different cells to their experiment, which had young folk who like unsigned guitar bands, able to listen to a number of tracks and then download which ones they thought they liked best. Cell 1 had to do this independently and monadically. Cell 2 got to see what other people had already chosen. Cell 3, we'll come on to that in a moment. Cell 2, interestingly, had the long-tail distribution, but each time that the experiment was done, a different thing would be number 1, which is kind of what we see in the real world. Cell 1 had a rather odd pattern, which didn't even reflect the short-tail distribution at all. It's rather confused and messy. Cell 3, which was the same as Cell 2, except that they inverted what was most popular to be the least popular. And again, you get the long-tail distribution with the change from period to period each time you do it, instance to instance each time you do it. So music is like that. Charitable giving tends to be like that, certainly the top end of the distribution. Having crunched 40 years of Giving USA data, and similarly in the UK, the top items that people give their charitable donations to remain the top items year after year after year, which is a sign of a certain kind of social influence. You might call it tradition and copying parents or so on. So that's interesting there. Some noise down the lower end, but basically at the top end it's that. And then spirits. I mean, it wouldn't be surprising to learn that most beverages and food items are culturally distributed, so our tastes and so on are not just biologically determined, and therefore they diffuse in a social manner. On the left-hand side, very differently, 2 items, and there are fewer, I've got to say, fewer items on the left-hand side than you might think. 2 items with different kinds of short-tail distribution. So on the one hand, deodorants is an interesting market. This is not deodorant brands, this is deodorant formats. So if you're a roll-on user, you're more likely to stay with the roll-on category than to upgrade to the aerosol, which is a problem for Procter's and Colgate and for Unilever, because the aerosol is much more profitable for us, for manufacturers. And this brief has come around any number of times in the times I've worked with those kind of organizations. And it's a real thing. People prefer the format there. So the product itself is actually quite important, which is relatively unusual and certainly very different to how we see in the other side of things. Car insurance market is really interesting, but different again from deodorants. Interesting in that there are so many different choices, so many different items, so many different SKUs that you could look at, and so many dimensions on which you could evaluate them. Another market that's like this happens to be the laptop market. There's 3,500 SKUs in the average European market, and it's impossible to compare all the items line by line, item by item, even though we'd like to pretend that we do sometimes. And that's why I suspect that these kind of markets have found a proliferation of things like comparison websites, which help us choose, make it easier to sort through those things. But the patterns are there, that's the important thing, and the patterns very quickly tell you where you are and therefore tell you the kind of things you might want to do. Now, in fact, we, in our work, and this is fast forwarding to chapter 7 of the final chapter of the book that's published today, is a map that looks like this, which adds a different dimension to the simple independent social and creates 4 buckets of styles of buying. The y-axis, the new axis, is essentially calculated on the speed of turnover of popularity in the markets that you're dealing with. But let's not worry about it. Let's just look at the buckets here that emerge, and the 4 broad styles of behavior that are indicated by the patterns in the data. So on the one hand, considered choice, which is probably closest to how implicitly many of our marketing colleagues imagine consumers buy their products in whatever market they sit and consider. It's a bit like some of those progressive sales funnel kind of models that until recently have held sway. In the picture there we've illustrated with a young man looking for a particular piece of vinyl that he's after, and only the particular one will work. Here the product itself is really important. It becomes less important as we move to the right. If you've had any connection with music, as I have over the years, as a geek, both a fan and a participant, you'll know that Marshall is the only amps you should follow, because the experts, the musicians that you admire, they use Marshall. Different again is what we might call a fashion market down below, where the copying, the social learning, is sort of less directed, which is much vaguer and basically follows any number of cues that are around an individual. This is common when you see lots of choices which are essentially the same functionally, and there's no expertise that's possible to access or necessary. Moving around again, then there's guesswork, and if you've tried to buy a non-Apple smartphone recently, you go into a mobile retailer and just faced with things that look the same, and you might as well guess. Anyway, so that's 4, and it's really useful. Very quickly you can get some quick understanding, let's say 65 or 70% understanding of the characteristics of that market, to develop the kind of strategy, a template if you like, for the strategy that would be appropriate. Because you can plot very simply how these kinds of businesses work, and you can see on this chart I plotted 4 of the 5 markets that we've looked at before. The one that I haven't done is spirits, and the reason why is because it actually fits clearly into 2 different chunks. Bottom right is where, for example, the vodka category lives, with this huge amount of noise, lots of new brands, lots of things. It's very difficult to tell one brand of vodka apart from another in terms of its product quality. In fact, some people would say in the drinks industry the whole point of vodka is not to be able to tell it's vodka, is the alcohol for people who don't like alcohol. Whereas by contrast, in the top right, you see things which have real social status, things like Belvedere or Grey Goose and so on, which try and generate some sense of expertise and authority in there. It's really useful, this kind of thing, to look at multiple markets, multiple regions, and allow you to develop really rapid understanding across huge amounts of data and to make strategic decisions. So, for example, one of the questions we always have when dealing with pan-European work is it France, or today let's imagine it's Germany is different. The German consumers, we're told, always buy, and they tell us, always buy on the basis of superior product and better engineering and better design. In many cases, this debunks that kind of thought by showing how people actually buy, whether they actually buy based on fashion, or whether they actually buy based on the quality of the products, whether they're bottom right or top left. And it also shows outliers, and shows very quickly, you can see by replotting this data, how things move quickly. And the Spain, which is the outlier to the left of the pack of flags you see there, is a market that increasingly in these kind of consumer markets is different because of what's happening supply side. Right. So that's just the approach. We could spend quite a long time going through the detail of the calculations. I think there's more than enough just to simply say long tail versus short tail, and turnover speed or lack of speed. So that's more of it we are happy to answer questions on. But for me, it's really useful for a number of reasons. The first of all, it gives me big, as I say, big return on effort. Very quickly, we have big shifts forward in our understanding of markets and compared to each other. Secondly, it answers this question strategically and based on behavior rather than based on media channels about social versus independent. But it raises 2, I think, other really good questions which are worth pondering on today. The first thing is asking us a what kind of question. And we don't normally ask a what kind of question in marketing or market research. We tend to ask specific questions. I think that's a kind of, it's noteworthy, I think. For those of you with I'm sorry, that chart hasn't come out very well. This is a quote from a great short story by Borges called on exactitude in science. Alinity describes a country who get really good at making maps, and they get really hooked on making more and more precise maps, and more precise maps, and more precise maps, until eventually the maps have the same scale as the thing they're trying to describe, and eventually they fall out of use because there is no use in that. And I think that's a really important thing to think about as we enter this age of big data, where we've got more than enough data to deal with. And in many ways, you know, many of us are arguing that data collection isn't the really big issue for us. It's how do we sweat the data that's coming at us from all kinds of dimensions or all kinds of directions. So maybe looking for patterns is more important than drilling down, and looking for patterns above the level of the individual as opposed to down at the level below. So I think that's one thing that's worth pondering on, that's raised by this kind of approach. I think, secondly, it raises questions about whether we've got enough stuff in our armory as researchers, enough methodological stuff to deal with this flood of social stuff. Because I'll be really clear, the left-hand side of this grid is much less populated than you'd imagine. Particularly the top left is very underpopulated. As I started at the beginning saying, much of our assumptions about how people do what they do is based on the idea that individuals act independently, and much of our practice is therefore best suited to that top left area. Now, whether or not you believe what people tell you, which is a whole other debate, and I'm sure John Kieran will have something to say about that in a moment, that seems to be the place that it's made for. It's not at all clear that our methodologies, our traditional methodologies of asking people about themselves and about the product are going to be useful in this other space. Indeed, it's not clear that asking people about the thing at all is relevant if it's the connections between people and the things that go on between them that really shapes their choices on the right-hand side of this map. Now, there have been some great innovations in the last few years, great innovations like the work that people like Ray and so on have been doing in communities, online, and the work that's being done. All of us have moved our basic Q&A stuff online, so that's good, and developing new tools using the Twitters and the Facebooks and so on, so that's fantastic. But that really is just a start. And the big question, I guess, in all of this is, what does research look like if it doesn't have a respondent? If an individual is not the locus for understanding the behavior, what does it really look like? And that's a challenge. I've got some thoughts myself, but interested to hear what other people have to say on that. So finally, I think this approach is something that is really useful, really helpful, and easy to do. And I would imagine that in a couple of years' time, lots and lots and lots of people will be doing this kind of thing. But it's not this kind of thing that I'm advocating for today. So not this particular thing I'm advocating for today, it's this kind of thing, looking at patterns in particular rather than boiling the ocean to deliver insight. Finding ways of dealing with big data rather than just hoping that drilling down and down and down is going to help us. And I hope you do too. Thank you very much. So first of all,